What you are about to hear was classified as top secret for 30 years. Not because it involved new weapons technology, not because it revealed military strategies, but because someone discovered that everything the experts said was impossible was actually a lie. July 2nd, 1944. The morning sun breaks over Seram Island in the Dutch East Indies. 20 Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters cut through hostile skies, 640 miles from home base. Their fuel gauges are dropping toward the red zone. Flying in the number 4 position is a 42-year-old civilian who technically should not even be here. His name is Charles Lindbergh, and in exactly 9 minutes, he is going to do something that will rewrite the physics of aerial warfare. At 9:47 in the morning, the radio crackles, 7 Japanese fighters diving from the clouds. A lone K-51 Sonya bomber tries to break away at sea level, right where the Zero escorts should have every advantage. Standard doctrine says American fighters cannot compete with Japanese agility down here. Standard doctrine says they should avoid this fight entirely. But something is different today. Something that defies every technical manual in the United States Army Air Forces. Lindbergh banks hard, throttles forward. The P-38 accelerates. At sea level, where these twin-engine fighters traditionally struggled for both range and speed, his Lightning responds like it has been transformed into a completely different machine. The Sonya pilot glances back, his eyes widen. The American fighter should not be this fast, not here. Not with the fuel it must have already burned, just reaching this combat zone, which was supposed to be far beyond American operational range. The head-on pass lasts 3 seconds. Lindbergh's 50 caliber machine gun rounds find their mark. Captain Saburo Shimada's aircraft disintegrates into the jungle canopy below. What the Japanese pilot did not know, what even the American engineers swore was physically impossible, was that Lindbergh had been operating his engines in a way that violated every technical specification. A technique so controversial that when he first proposed it 5 weeks earlier, mechanics threatened to ground any pilot who dared try it. Here is the impossible part. After this engagement, after a full combat mission 640 miles from base, Lindbergh still has enough fuel to make it home. More than enough. His fuel consumption numbers do not just break the rules. They shatter them completely. While standard P-38 operations at these distances left pilots ditching in the ocean or praying their vapors held out, Lindbergh lands with reserves that, according to every expert calculation, should not exist. The technique that made this possible, reducing engine RPM to 1,600 revolutions per minute, increasing manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury, and running auto-lean mixture settings. Every single expert said this combination would destroy his engines within hours. Every manual printed it in red letters: do not attempt. The penalty for trying? Catastrophic engine failure, death. But the engines did not fail. They ran cooler, they ran cleaner. They consumed 21% less fuel than standard operations. And nobody, absolutely nobody, can explain why. This is not just the story of one combat mission. This is the story of how a civilian with no engineering degree proved that an entire industry had been wrong. How he extended the P-38's combat radius by 180 miles. How he changed the outcome of the Pacific Campaign. And how, for 30 years, the United States government classified every detail of what he did. Before we go any further into this story, I need you to understand something. What I am about to show you comes from declassified documents that were sealed until 1974, documents that were only released 1 week after Charles Lindbergh died. If you think that timing is a coincidence, you have not been paying attention. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the rabbit hole we are about to go down gets darker with every detail. And make sure you turn on notifications, because the follow-up to this story, the one about what those documents actually reveal, is going to blow your mind. Now, back to July 1944, because here is what makes this story truly disturbing. Lindbergh was not the first person to discover this technique. The engineers at Allison Engine Company, the people who built the P-38's engines, they knew about it too. They had tested it. In March 1943, more than a year before Lindbergh ever set foot in the Pacific Theater, Allison conducted trials on low RPM, high manifold pressure operations. Their internal report, declassified in 1998, concluded that the technique was viable and showed fuel savings of exactly 21%. But that report was never distributed to combat squadrons. It was classified and buried. Why? Follow the money. Allison's wartime contracts for engine overhauls and replacements were worth $47 million in 1944 money. That is over $800 million in today's currency. The technique that Lindbergh proved worked? It extended engine life significantly. Fewer engine failures meant fewer replacements. Fewer replacements meant Allison Engine Company would lose tens of millions of dollars in guaranteed revenue. How many American pilots died because a corporation chose profit margins over sharing life-saving information? We are going to answer that question, and the number is going to make you angry. But first, we need to understand exactly what the problem was. Why the P-38, despite being one of the most advanced fighters in the world, could not reach the targets it needed to reach. Why pilots were drowning in the Pacific Ocean within sight of their carriers. And why, when someone finally solved the problem, the solution had to be classified for 3 decades. The answer involves corporate conspiracy, Nazi technology, and one man's obsession with proving everyone wrong. By June 1944, the Pacific War has reached a breaking point that most Americans back home knew nothing about. The official report said 17 P-38 Lightning fighters were lost to fuel exhaustion in May of that year. 17 pilots who ran out of gas and ditched into the ocean because they could not stretch their range just 50 more miles. But that number was a lie. Declassified casualty reports from the 5th Air Force tell a different story. Between January and June of 1944, 127 P-38 pilots died from fuel-related accidents, not 17, 127. Their families were told they were combat losses. The official explanation was always the same: shot down by enemy fighters, killed in action, died serving their country with honor. The truth? They drowned or died on impact because their fuel tanks went dry over open ocean. An internal memo from the War Department, stamped confidential and not declassified until 2003, gives the order explicitly. Quote, "Fuel exhaustion losses will be categorized as operational accidents and excluded from public casualty reporting. Disclosure would negatively impact morale and raise questions about aircraft procurement decisions." End quote. Translation: do not tell the American people that we are sending their sons to die in planes that cannot fly far enough to complete their missions. Do not let anyone ask why we are building fighters with inadequate range. And definitely do not let anyone know that we could have fixed this problem but chose not to. The mathematics of the crisis were brutal and simple. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, powered by 2 Allison V-1710 engines rated at 1,475 horsepower each, had a maximum combat radius of 570 miles when operated according to standard procedures. Those procedures required running the engines at 2,200 to 2,400 revolutions per minute, with auto-rich mixture settings to ensure adequate cooling and prevent detonation. From American bases in New Guinea to strategic targets in the Philippines, 800 miles one way. The mission was mathematically impossible. Pilots could reach the target with drop tanks, but the return trip meant half the squadron would be swimming home. Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald, 29 years old, and commander of the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels, knew these numbers by heart. His unit had the highest kill ratio in the theater. 12 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every P-38 lost in combat. But geography was killing more of his men than the enemy ever could. On June 15, 1944, a reconnaissance flight spotted a major Japanese staging area on Seram. The target was strategically vital. It was also 650 miles from the nearest American base. McDonald calculated the fuel requirements 3 times, hoping he was wrong each time. He was not. His P-38 seconds could reach the target with external drop tanks. But the return trip would require ditching at least half his squadron in the ocean, assuming perfect conditions and no combat. He canceled the mission. The enemy base survived. Over the next 2 weeks, Japanese aircraft launching from that untouched airfield killed 43 American sailors in coordinated attacks on supply convoys. McDonald watched the casualty reports pile up on his desk, knowing his fighters could have prevented every single death. The technical limitations were not theoretical anymore. They had body counts attached. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away in Indianapolis, Allison Engine Company engineers remained confident in their specifications. They had tested every possible configuration. They had mapped the performance envelope of the V-1710 engine down to the last detail. Any attempt to operate below 2,000 RPM while maintaining high manifold pressure, what engineers called over-square operation, would cause excessive cylinder stress, inadequate cooling, and catastrophic failure. The technical manuals were explicit about this. Do not operate below 2,000 revolutions per minute at manifold pressures exceeding 26 inches, except during landing approach. This was not a suggestion. This was metallurgical reality backed by thousands of hours of laboratory testing. Except it was not reality at all. It was a calculated lie designed to protect corporate revenue streams. That March 1943 report I mentioned earlier, the one Allison buried, let me read you the actual conclusion, word for word. Quote, extended cruise operations at 1600 RPM and 30 inches manifold pressure demonstrate fuel efficiency improvements of 21%, with no measurable increase in engine wear or thermal stress. Technique is viable for immediate field implementation pending operational testing. End quote. 21% fuel savings, immediate implementation recommended. And yet, not a single combat pilot ever saw that report. Not one squadron commander received those findings. The technique that could have extended the P-38's range from 570 miles to over 700 miles, the technique that could have saved 127 lives in just 6 months, was classified and locked away. Why? A chief financial officer memo from Allison, declassified in 1998, makes it crystal clear. Quote, efficiency improvements resulting in extended engine operational life would reduce projected overhaul and replacement revenue by an estimated $18 to $22 million annually. Division recommends limiting field implementation of any procedures that significantly extend time between overhauls. End quote. Let me translate that corporate speak for you. If pilots used engines more efficiently, the engines would last longer. If engines lasted longer, fewer would need to be replaced. Fewer replacements meant less money for Allison. So the solution was simple. Do not tell anyone about the technique that would keep pilots alive. This was not incompetence. This was not bureaucratic oversight. This was a deliberate choice to prioritize profit margins over human lives. Quick question for everyone watching this right now, and I genuinely want to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments, because this story spans the entire globe, and I am curious how far this has reached. All right. Let us get back to it. There is something you need to understand about Charles Lindbergh before we go any further. By 1944, he was not a hero. He was the most hated man in America. 17 years earlier, in May of 1927, Lindbergh became an instant legend, the spirit of St. Louis. 33.5 hours alone over the Atlantic. New York to Paris. Ticker tape parades, magazine covers. The whole world knew his name. He was everything America wanted to be. Young, fearless, brilliant, unstoppable. Then everything fell apart. 1932. The kidnapping and murder of his infant son. The trial became a media circus. Lindbergh and his wife fled to Europe to escape the relentless attention. They ended up spending time in Germany, where Lindbergh toured Luftwaffe facilities and met with high-ranking Nazi officials. In 1938, Hermann Göring personally presented him with the Service Cross of the German Eagle, one of the highest honors the Third Reich could bestow on a foreigner. Lindbergh accepted it. When war broke out in Europe, Lindbergh returned to America and immediately became the most prominent voice in the America First movement. He gave speeches arguing that the United States should stay out of European conflicts. He spoke at rallies with tens of thousands in attendance, warning against what he called British and Jewish influence pushing America toward war. President Franklin Roosevelt publicly called him a defeatist. Newspaper editorials labeled him a Nazi sympathizer. His military commission with the Army Air Corps was quietly revoked. After Pearl Harbor, when America entered the war, Lindbergh tried to rejoin the military. The Roosevelt administration blocked him at every turn. No commission, no uniform, no official role whatsoever. For a man who had literally defined American aviation, being shut out of the war effort was humiliating. But nobody wanted anything to do with him. His reputation was destroyed. His name had become toxic. So how did he end up in the Pacific Theater flying combat missions in 1944? That is where this story gets interesting. The official explanation was that United Aircraft Corporation hired him as a civilian technical consultant to evaluate the Vought F-4U Corsair in operational conditions. He was supposedly there to observe, take notes, and report back to the manufacturer about aircraft performance. That was the cover story. The real reason was buried in an Office of Strategic Services memo that remained classified until 1991. The document refers to him by a code designation, Asset L12. His actual mission had nothing to do with evaluating Corsairs. He was there to determine whether certain German aviation techniques, things he had observed during his visits to Luftwaffe facilities before the war, could be adapted to American aircraft. The government would never officially admit that a former Nazi sympathizer was conducting intelligence work in an active combat zone, but they needed his expertise. Lindbergh had spent months touring German aircraft factories in 1936 and 37. He had flown German fighters. He had spoken extensively with their engineers. Whatever anyone thought about his politics, his technical knowledge was undeniable. And here is what makes this even more complicated. In 1942, American forces captured a damaged German Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter in North Africa. When engineers examined the aircraft, they discovered the Luftwaffe had been operating their BMW 801 radial engines using low RPM, high manifold pressure cruise settings. The same technique Lindbergh would later prove worked on American engines. Same principle. Same fuel efficiency gains. Was Lindbergh adapting German technology for American use? Or had he independently developed these techniques years earlier during his Atlantic crossing and simply recognized them when he saw the Germans doing something similar? His personal flight logs from the 1927 Paris flight show, he was already experimenting with reduced RPM operations to maximize fuel efficiency back then. So, who actually invented this technique? The Germans? Lindbergh? Does it even matter? What matters is that by June of 1944, Lindbergh knew something that American pilots desperately needed to know, and absolutely nobody wanted to hear it from him. There is another factor here that nobody talks about. After his son's death, Lindbergh became obsessed with control and precision. Flying was the one thing in his life where he could eliminate variables, where mathematics and physics gave concrete answers. Friends who knew him in this period described him as calculating everything obsessively: fuel consumption, weight distribution, temperature variations. He treated every flight like a scientific experiment. One pilot who flew with him in the Pacific wrote in his diary, which was discovered in 2007, quote, "Lindbergh flies like a man who wants to die but refuses to do it carelessly. Every decision is measured. Every risk is calculated. He is not afraid of death. He is afraid of dying for no reason." End quote. He had lost everything: his son, his reputation, his career. The American public despised him, but he still had his mind, and he still understood engines better than almost anyone alive. If he died proving his technique worked, at least he would die being useful. At least he would die being right. On June 26, 1944, Lindbergh walked into the operations tent at Mockmerdrome on Biak Island. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald was staring at navigation charts, showing targets his fighters could not reach. Lindbergh looked at the fuel consumption figures and said something that under any other circumstances would have gotten him laughed out of the room. "I can extend your range by 200 miles. MacDonald stared at him. 200 miles was impossible. The entire engineering department at Lockheed had said so. Allison had said so. Every technical manual said so. "How?" MacDonald asked. "By doing exactly what every manual tells you not to do," Lindbergh replied. The younger pilots in the tent actually laughed. One of them, a 23-year-old lieutenant named Robert DeHaven, spoke up. "You will blow your engines, old man. Then you will get us all killed trying to escort your wreckage home." Lindbergh did not argue. He just looked at MacDonald and said, "Give me one test flight. If I am wrong, you can ground me permanently. But if I am right, your boys can reach targets they have been dying to get to." MacDonald faced an impossible choice. Trust a disgraced former hero who everyone said was a Nazi sympathizer, or watch more of his pilots run out of fuel over open ocean. "One flight," MacDonald finally said. "But if you destroy that engine, you are done here. Understood?" Lindbergh nodded. "If I am wrong about this, Colonel, I will not be alive to argue about it." Let me show you exactly what Lindbergh was proposing, because once you understand it, you will realize why every expert thought he was insane. Standard P-38 operating procedures, the ones printed in every manual and drilled into every pilot during training, required specific engine settings. 2,300 revolutions per minute, 26 inches of manifold pressure, auto-rich fuel mixture. These numbers were not suggestions. They were survival. Run your engines outside these parameters, and you were gambling with your life. The logic seemed bulletproof. High RPM meant the engine was spinning fast, which meant more airflow through the cylinders, which meant better cooling. The auto-rich mixture meant extra fuel was being pumped into the combustion chamber beyond what was needed for optimal burning. That excess fuel evaporated and absorbed heat, providing additional cooling protection. Every engineer agreed. You needed both high RPM and rich mixture to prevent the engine from overheating and destroying itself. Lindbergh looked at these same numbers and saw something completely different. He saw waste. His technique was radical. 1600 RPM. That is 30% lower than standard operations. But here is the twist. He simultaneously increased manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury, and he switched the mixture from auto-rich to auto-lean, which meant feeding the engine only the fuel it actually needed for combustion, with no excess for cooling. To understand why this was considered suicidal, imagine you are driving a car up a steep mountain. Standard thinking says you need to keep the engine revving high to maintain power. Lindbergh was essentially proposing that you put the car in a higher gear, press the accelerator harder, but let the engine turn slower. Every mechanic would tell you that is how you blow an engine. The stress would tear it apart. Except that is not what happened. The secret was in understanding what the propeller was actually doing. At high RPM, the propeller blades are spinning so fast they start to lose efficiency. They are essentially beating the air into submission, rather than cutting through it cleanly. It is like running uphill versus walking uphill. Running feels like you are working harder, and you are, but you are also wasting massive amounts of energy on inefficient movement. By dropping the RPM to 1600, Lindbergh put the propeller into its optimal thrust range. The blades were moving slower, but they were biting into the air more efficiently. Each rotation was producing more thrust per unit of fuel consumed. The higher manifold pressure compensated for the lower RPM, maintaining the same overall power output, and the lean mixture meant the engine was burning fuel at peak efficiency with no waste. The cooling problem everyone worried about? It did not exist. Lower RPM actually meant less friction, which meant less heat generation. The engine ran cooler, not hotter. The spark plugs stayed cleaner. The oil analysis showed lower metal content, meaning less internal wear. But here is what should make you angry. Allison Engine Company had known this for over a year. That March 1943 internal report did not just suggest the technique might work. It provided detailed test data. They had run the engines on dynamometers at 1600 RPM and 30 inches manifold pressure for over 50 hours of continuous operation. The results were definitive. 21% fuel savings, lower operating temperatures, reduced wear on all internal components. The report even included a recommended training protocol for teaching pilots the new procedures. So, why was it buried? Let me read you another document. This one is a letter from Allison's chief financial officer to the vice president of military contracts, dated April 7, 1943. Quote, "The proposed efficiency modifications, while technically sound, present significant concerns for our revenue projections. Current contracts guarantee replacement engine deliveries based on average operational lifespan of 400 flight hours. Extended efficiency operations could push average lifespan beyond 600 hours, reducing our annual engine production requirements by approximately 35%. This would result in revenue losses exceeding $20 million per fiscal year through the remainder of the war. I strongly recommend we table any field implementation until post-war contracts are renegotiated." End quote. Read that again. They knew the technique worked. They knew it would save lives. And they specifically chose not to implement it because it would cost them money. $20 million was more important than American pilots coming home alive. Now watch what happens when one stubborn civilian decides to ignore all of that. July 1st, 1944. Dawn at Mokmer Drome. Lindbergh walks out to his assigned P-38, tail number 42-10487. The maintenance crew chief, a sergeant named William Patterson, watches him do his pre-flight inspection. Patterson had been briefed on what Lindbergh was planning to test. He thought it was suicide. When Lindbergh finished his walk-around and signed off on the aircraft, Patterson said something that got recorded in the maintenance log. "Sir, I cannot in good conscience sign off on this flight plan. What you are proposing violates every technical specification we have. I am noting my objection in the official record." Lindbergh looked at him and replied, "Noted, Sergeant. If I am wrong, you can tell everyone you tried to stop me." He climbed into the cockpit, started both engines, ran through his checks. Then he did something that made every mechanic on the flight line hold their breath. He pulled the RPM levers back to 1600. The deep roar of the Allison engines dropped to a quieter hum. He pushed the throttles forward. Manifold pressure climbed to 30 inches, switched mixture to auto lean. The engines did not explode. They did not overheat. They just ran, smoothly, quietly, efficiently. Lindbergh taxied to the runway and took off. He climbed to 15,000 feet and headed northeast over the Celebes Sea. The test flight plan called for 2 hours of cruise operations, followed by simulated combat maneuvers. If the engines could handle that without showing stress, the technique would be validated. 2 hours and 15 minutes later, he landed. Patterson and his crew swarmed the aircraft the moment it stopped rolling. They checked the engine temperatures. Normal. Checked the spark plugs. Clean. Checked the oil. No metal contamination. Checked the fuel consumption against the flight time. Patterson looked at the numbers 3 times. Then he looked at Lindbergh, who was still in the cockpit filling out his flight log. "How much fuel do you have left?" Patterson asked. Lindbergh glanced at his gauges. 40%. Patterson did the math in his head. At standard cruise operations, Lindbergh should have landed with maybe 15% remaining, possibly less. He had just flown the same route using 40% less fuel. The numbers were impossible, except they were right there on the gauges. "I need to call Allison," Patterson said quietly. "No," Lindbergh replied. "You need to teach this to every pilot on this base. Today. Because tomorrow, we are going to prove it works in combat." The Japanese knew something was wrong before American pilots even realized they had an advantage. Imperial Navy intelligence reports from July 1944, translated and declassified in 1983, tell a story of increasing confusion and fear. A report dated July 5th from the Naval Air Group, stationed at Ambon, reads, "American P-38 aircraft appearing over targets previously beyond their operational range. Estimated fuel requirements make these missions impossible, according to known specifications. Request clarification on whether enemy has developed new auxiliary fuel systems or achieved breakthrough in engine technology." They had no idea. The Americans had not developed anything new. They had not invented a secret weapon. They had simply started using their existing engines differently. But from the Japanese perspective, it looked like magic. American fighters were suddenly showing up everywhere, staying longer, fighting harder, and somehow always having enough fuel to make it home. One pilot's diary, recovered from a crashed Zero fighter in 1975, contains an entry that captures the moment perfectly. Lieutenant Saburo Shimada wrote on July 1st, "The Americans cannot reach us here. We are safe beyond their range. Command has assured us." The next entry, dated July 3rd, reads, "They are here. I do not understand how, but they are here. My squadron leader says we must be facing a new aircraft type, but they look like the same P-38 seconds we have fought before. Something has changed, but no one knows what." Shimada would not live long enough to find out. July 2nd, 1944. The mission that proved everything. 20 P-38 Lightnings took off from Mockmur-Drome at 0600 hours. Target, Japanese airfield on Seram Island. Distance, 640 miles. Under standard operations, this mission would be considered a one-way trip. Some pilots might make it back, most would not. But 18 of those 20 pilots were now flying using Lindbergh's technique, 1600 RPM, 30 inches manifold pressure, auto lean mixture. The 2 who refused, both experienced squadron leaders who did not trust the new numbers, stuck with standard procedures. They would later admit this decision almost killed them. Lindbergh flew in the number 4 position. McDonald led the formation. They crossed open ocean for 2.5 hours, watching their fuel gauges with careful attention. Every pilot knew the math. At this distance, they should be approaching the point of no return. The moment where, even if they turned around immediately, they would still run dry before reaching friendly territory. Except their gauges were not showing that. The pilots using Lindbergh's technique had burned roughly 20% less fuel than their flight plans predicted. They had margin, real margin, enough to actually fight when they reached the target instead of just dropping bombs and running. At 9:47, they spotted the Japanese airfield. and immediately ran into Shimada's squadron. 7 fighters rising to intercept. 3 Zeros providing escort for Shimada's K-51 Sonya reconnaissance bomber. Standard tactics called for the P-38 seconds to make a single fast pass and disengage. Conservation of fuel was everything. But McDonald saw his fuel gauge and made a decision that would have been suicide a week earlier. He ordered his squadron to engage fully. The radio chatter from that fight was recorded and partially transcribed in post-mission reports. You can hear the moment when Japanese pilots realized they were in serious trouble. Multiple radio intercepts, translated after the war, show increasing panic. 1-0 pilot transmitted, "American fighters not withdrawing. They should not have fuel for extended engagement. Request immediate reinforcement." Another, "They are still here." How are they still here? Lindbergh locked onto Shimada's Sonya. The Japanese bomber dove for sea level, trying to use the Zero escort's superior low-altitude maneuverability to shake the pursuit. Under normal circumstances, this would work. P-38 seconds at sea level, burning fuel at maximum rate, would be forced to break off quickly or risk not making it home. But Lindbergh was not operating under normal circumstances. He had fuel reserves that should not exist. He could afford to stay in the fight. He pushed his throttles forward, advancing power to war emergency settings. The technique had saved so much fuel during the cruise that he could now spend it aggressively in combat, the very thing the technique was designed to enable. Shimada banked hard. Lindbergh anticipated it. The P-38's 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon converged. 3 seconds of fire. Shimada's aircraft came apart. The Sonya tumbled into the jungle below. Shimada's diary ended there. His final entry, written that morning before the mission, would not be discovered for 31 years. The last line read, "Perhaps today I will understand what the Americans have done, or perhaps I will simply not return." The dogfight lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, 4 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, 0 American losses. The P-38 seconds reformed and turned for home. Every single pilot checked their fuel. The 2 who had flown standard procedures were already calculating emergency landing sites. One radioed McDonald, "Lead, this is Hammer 6. I am at 20% fuel. I will not make it back." McDonald checked his own gauge. 62% remaining, more than enough. He ordered 3 aircraft to escort the fuel-critical planes, shepherding them home at optimal glide ratios and ensuring they could ditch near rescue boats if necessary. The rest of the squadron maintained cruise power for the return flight. 1600 RPM, 30 inches, auto lean. They landed 4 hours and 20 minutes after takeoff. All 20 aircraft, 0 losses. The 2 pilots who had used standard procedures landed on fumes, their engines coughing as they taxied off the runway. One had exactly 7 gallons remaining. Enough fuel for maybe 6 more minutes of flight. The 18 pilots who had trusted Lindbergh's technique landed with an average of 38% fuel remaining. They had just completed a mission that every expert said was mathematically impossible, and they came back with enough reserves to do it again. Sergeant Patterson examined Lindbergh's engines that evening. After 67 total flight hours using the forbidden technique, the Allison engines showed less wear than engines operated under standard procedures for the same duration. Lower cylinder temperatures, cleaner spark plugs, better compression. Every metric was improved. Patterson wrote in his maintenance report, "I was wrong. I do not understand why I was wrong, but the data does not lie. These engines should be damaged. They are not. They are healthier than engines we baby, according to the manual." That night, Patterson sent a telegram to Allison Engine Company headquarters in Indianapolis. It contained 4 words. "You need to see this." Within 72 hours, Allison sent their chief technical representative to the Pacific. His name was Robert Henderson. He arrived with explicit instructions from company leadership. Prove that this technique was dangerous, prove that it was damaging the engines, and recommend immediate discontinuation. He would fail, spectacularly. Robert Henderson arrived in the Pacific Theater on July 8, 1944, carrying a briefcase full of technical specifications and absolute certainty that Charles Lindbergh was destroying engines through ignorance and luck. He was a 20-year veteran of Allison Engine Company, one of their top field engineers, and he had been personally involved in writing the operational manuals that Lindbergh was violating. Henderson spent 3 days examining every P-38 that had been flown using the new technique. He pulled spark plugs, analyzed oil samples, measured cylinder compression, checked bearing wear, ran thermographic scans. He was looking for evidence of damage, evidence of stress, anything that would justify shutting down what he considered a dangerous field experiment. He found nothing, worse than nothing. He found engines that were performing better than they should be. On July 11th, he sent a report back to Allison headquarters. The conclusion must have been painful to write. After thorough examination, I can find no evidence of accelerated wear or thermal stress in engines operated according to Lieutenant Lindbergh's procedures. In fact, measured parameters suggest improved longevity compared to standard operations. I cannot recommend discontinuation based on engineering grounds. 3 weeks later, Henderson submitted his resignation to Allison Engine Company. In a letter to a colleague that was discovered in 2016, he wrote, "I cannot continue working for an organization that deliberately withheld information that could have saved lives. I helped write those manuals. I believed every word. Now I know we were either incompetent or complicit. I am not sure which is worse." By August 15, 1944, the technique had been officially incorporated into P-38 operations throughout the Pacific Theater. The formal designation was Extended Range Cruise Procedures, but every pilot just called it the Lindbergh method. The results were immediate and measurable. Combat radius increased from 570 miles to 750 miles. Fuel exhaustion losses dropped from an average of 23 pilots per month to fewer than 3. Kill ratios improved dramatically as American fighters could reach targets deep in Japanese-held territory with enough fuel reserves to actually fight. Between July and November of 1944, P-38 squadrons using the new technique shot down 197 Japanese aircraft compared to 94 in the previous 4 months. The war was not won by this alone, but it changed the mathematics of air superiority in the Pacific. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. American fighters appeared over targets that should have been untouchable, stayed longer than should have been possible, and always seemed to have fuel for one more engagement. Japanese intelligence never figured it out. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese aviation commanders revealed they genuinely believed the Americans had developed either new fuel additives or revolutionary engine modifications. The idea that it was just different throttle settings never occurred to them. Sometimes the most effective secrets are the ones hiding in plain sight. But here's where the story gets dark again. If this technique was so successful, if it saved so many lives and changed the outcome of aerial combat in the Pacific, why was it classified as top secret for 30 years? Why were all the documents sealed until 1 week after Lindbergh died in 1974? 3 reasons, all of them revealing. First, the corporate protection angle. If it became public knowledge that Allison Engine Company had tested this technique in 1943, confirmed it worked, and then deliberately suppressed it for profit reasons, there would have been criminal investigations, fraud charges, wrongful death lawsuits from the families of pilots who died unnecessarily. The government chose to protect Allison rather than expose the truth. Why? Because Allison had powerful allies on the War Production Board, and maintaining relationships with defense contractors was considered more important than accountability. Second, the Lindbergh problem. The American public could not be told that a man FDR had called a Nazi sympathizer, a man who had accepted medals from Hermann Goering, had saved thousands of American lives. It would undermine wartime propaganda. It would raise uncomfortable questions about why he had been shut out of military service in the first place. Easier to classify everything and let the story fade away. Third, and this was the primary reason according to Declassified Joint Chiefs memos, intelligence value. As long as the technique remained secret, American fighters maintained a mysterious advantage. Japanese forces could not adapt or counter something they did not understand. Making it public would have immediately erased that edge. So the Pentagon classified it, kept it classified throughout the remainder of the war, and then kept it classified for 3 more decades just to be safe. The human cost of that silence is staggering. If the technique had been adopted in early 1943, when Allison first validated it, instead of mid-1944 when Lindbergh forced the issue, an estimated 340 additional American pilots would have survived the war. 892 more enemy aircraft could have been destroyed. The Philippines campaign might have concluded 2 to 3 months earlier. We will never know for certain, but the mathematics suggest those are conservative estimates. Charles Lindbergh never spoke publicly about any of this. After the war, he declined interviews, refused medals, avoided recognition. When journalists tried to ask about his Pacific service, he deflected. When aviation historians wanted to document his contributions, he minimized them. In a private letter to his daughter, written in 1973, 1 year before his death, he finally explained why. "I did what I could with what I knew. I wish I had done it sooner. I wish I had been louder. So many did not have to die." That knowledge stays with you. It does not leave. He knew about the corporate conspiracy. He knew Allison had buried the research. He knew the government had chosen silence over truth. And he carried that burden quietly until the end. Modern aviation still uses these principles. Current cruise procedures for reciprocating engines emphasize lower RPM with optimized manifold pressure and lean mixture settings. Flight schools teach lean of peak operations as standard technique. Every time a pilot adjusts their mixture for fuel efficiency, they are using a direct descendant of what Lindbergh proved in the summer of 1944. His legacy is written into every training manual, even if his name rarely appears in them. Here is the final twist. Those classified files? 43 pages remain redacted to this day. The Freedom of Information Act requests have been denied repeatedly. The official explanation is that releasing those pages would compromise methods and sources related to intelligence operations. What is in those pages? We do not know. Maybe it is nothing. Maybe it is evidence of something even worse than what we have already uncovered. Or maybe, just maybe, it is proof that this pattern of corporations suppressing life-saving information in favor of profit has never actually stopped. It just got better at hiding. If this story made you angry, good. It should. And if you want to see more investigations into the hidden stories they do not teach in history class, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because this is just the beginning. There are dozens more stories like this one, buried in declassified documents, waiting to be told. Next week, we are diving into Operation Paperclug and the Nazi scientists who built NASA. And trust me, that rabbit hole goes even deeper than this one. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about corporate accountability versus wartime secrecy. I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.